Afternoon. Let's do some business. In fact, we're doing it live right here, doing more at 4 weekday afternoons. We get right down to business with the news driven hour right after Ben Shapiro and just before the 790 KBC News Blitz with Randy Wang at 5. Mottek On Money, live on the air, 790 KBC, streaming live online worldwide at kbc.com. And yes, the on-demand Mottek On Money podcast, kbc.com, Apple, iTunes, and all your favorite podcast platforms. One of the strongest hurricanes in recorded history, taking aim at Florida. We're tracking Hurricane Milton in the Gulf of Mexico. Oil prices spike as the storm disrupts oil operations in the Gulf. This at a time of intense tensions in the Middle East following Iran's missile attack on Israel last week. This as the solemn one-year anniversary of the terror attack on Israel by Hamas is being remembered today. The stock market ending sharply lower, kick off the new week after the Dow finished last week at an all-time high. Treasury yields climbing above 4% for the first time since August. A big move in bond yields today, impacting fixed-rate mortgage rates, among other things. The Dow coming in for a closing loss of nearly 400 points, settling at 41,954. The S&P 500 slipped 55, and the Nasdaq down 214 points. The yield in the 10-year note now at 4.03%. Price of oil spiking today, back above $80 a barrel in New York. Florida's storm-battered Gulf Coast racing against a Cat 5 hurricane today as workers sprint to pick up heaps of appliances and other street debris left over from Hurricane Helene just 2 weeks ago. And Florida highways clogged with people fleeing ahead of that storm. I'll be joined later this hour by America's leading hurricane expert, Fox Weather hurricane specialist Brian Norcross will be joining me live later this hour. Property and casualty insurance and reinsurance stocks were hit today as Hurricane Milton rapidly strengthened in the past 24 hours in the Gulf of Mexico, now headed for Florida's Gulf Coast. That's the west coast of Florida. Milton now a Cat 5 storm, Category 5 storm with winds of about 175 miles an hour, and may strike the densely populated Tampa metropolitan area with about 3 million people, second only to the Miami area and the South Florida area in that state. 1 year after the terror attack by Hamas and Israel's ensuing war in Gaza, the tension in the Middle East has only heightened, drawing the attention of market participants the world over. We see global Brent crude prices settling above $80 a barrel for the first time since August, as the risk of an Israeli response to last week's Iranian missile strike intensified. Tensions between Israel and Iran following Iran's missile attack on Israel last week, and reports that the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, was meeting with his military advisors have kept oil traders on guard for oil price spikes. The global supply chain back in focus recently with last week's port strike, which was temporarily suspended until January 15th. Now there's a new effort to safeguard the U.S. supply chain with a proposed Supply Chain Act in Congress. I'll discuss that this hour with Republican Southern California Congresswoman Michelle Steele, who has filed that proposed Safeguarding the Supply Chain Act. Congresswoman Michelle Steele will be joining us live later this hour. Looks like the volatility index, a gauge of expected volatility for stocks, hitting its highest level in about a month today with the latest move in the financial markets. Shares of Trump Media and Technology Group moving higher today by about 14%, 2 days after Tesla CEO Elon Musk joined former President Trump on stage at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. Joining us live now on Your Money, the markets and the economy and the whole works, top-ranked money manager Ken Winans, CEO and Chief Investment Officer at Winans Investments, which you can find at winansinvestments.com. Ken Winans, also a market historian, author of numerous books, including Investment Atlas 1 and 2, also a Forbes magazine contributor, and host of Winning with Winans here on 790 KBC. That'll be coming up this evening at 6 p.m. Ken Winans, thank you very much for joining us live here in the studio.
Frank, it's amazing how October's, when you think we've cleared everything, and then here we go with, as we would say, a very volatile October. And unfortunately, there's a lot of other pieces of news that are coming out throughout the remainder of this week that could actually help the market or make it much worse. So volatility is here to stay for a while. But as you just mentioned, this is very clearly a scenario of bottlenecks and distribution disruptions of fossil fuels, natural gas and crude oil. And of course, we're getting ready to start doing the stockpiles of natural gas going into winter. So unfortunately, it's sadly to say the making of a perfect economic storm.
Certainly, we're watching the energy markets very closely here, and we did get that stronger than expected jobs report on Friday. And as you mentioned, a new reading on inflation will be coming out, I believe, on Wednesday. And the Fed, of course, focused on inflation as well as jobs, given the spike in bond yields, which is also pretty significant. The yield on the 10-year back at 4.03%. What do you make of these latest developments and what the Fed's next move might be?
Well, I think a lot of it's also going to be earnings. We're just now starting earnings season, and I think it's going to be as it's been throughout much of the last 2 years, good, bad, and ugly. But the one thing, and we have to keep reminding ourselves of this, we have not licked inflation. It is not over yet. It is subdued, but it can come back very quickly. It doesn't take much, like we just talked about, the disruption of energy prices to bring it all back very strong, which would force the Fed to make some moves. So it is just going to continue to be very messy from that standpoint. I would also just say, too, a lot of stuff over the weekend about gold, and I think it's safe to say that precious metal prices will continue to climb as we go through these kind of scenarios.
Definitely focused on gold these days, which hit a record high above $2,700 an ounce recently. Right now it's around $2,663 an ounce, pulling back about $3 here at the moment. We have the analog gold, as we call it here, physical gold as well as digital gold. And you also track the cryptos. Bitcoin's been all over the place. Looks like it's been moving up lately, above 63K. What are your thoughts about analog gold and digital gold here?
Well, to use the technical analysis talk about Bitcoin is what we call range bound. It means it's trading in a channel. It's been going back and forth for about the last about 10 months like this. The real volatility has been in some of the other areas like Ethereum. It's finally bouncing back, but it's actually interesting to have a Bitcoin and Ethereum be that different in how they've been trading. But I will bring up, as we've talked about many, many times, the NASDAQ and the moves in the NASDAQ have a very strange effect, especially on Bitcoin. That relationship is still intact. I expect it to be that way as we move forward.
All right. A lot of listeners also follow the Bitcoin miners and the various platforms. How are they looking these days?
Well, there's a transition right now with the Bitcoin miners. And look, it's all about power. AI, it's funny, there was an article talking about warehouse space, that a lot of people who were building warehouses are now building data centers and mining centers. So I think that's going to continue. But there's a real fight right now to who's going to get the power. Is it going to be AI or is it going to be Bitcoin miners or crypto miners?
All right. Coinbase, for example, how's that one looking?
It had a big day today, actually. Coinbase moved up very nicely today. I still think for the average investor, Coinbase, because it is an exchange, which means it's like the NASDAQ of crypto. It doesn't matter who's hot, who's not. You're going to trade it on a place like Coinbase, and it is more secure than a lot of the other exchanges. It's also insured. So if something happened, if somebody gets hacked, they have some coverage.
Also volatile, right? Coinbase and BITO, the Bitcoin ETF, right, which shows off a dividend, by the way. Have you taken a look at that one?
No, you know what? I probably should. It's just, Frank, there's so many of them. It's hard to be on track of all of them.
Right, and it is. And so my hat goes off to you for getting your crypto credentials not too long ago, right? And you followed the altcoins, too. Remember when that big jump in Shiba Inu and Doge, of course, made news when Elon Musk talked about it on Saturday Night Live already a couple of years back? What about these altcoins? Anything getting your attention? There's
going to be a lot of talk next year about the stablecoins. A lot of talk. Because right now, the SEC is, when I was back in Washington, D.C., there was a lot of talk about regulation and who's going to be doing the regulation and who's on top of this. And it's all concerned about the possibility of fraud and corruption. But stablecoins being, and Tether being one of them, that is actually tied to something seems to be more favorable to the regulators. So I think they'll have a much easier time getting that across than they would some other kind of coins.
All right. Looking at what's happening now on the Florida West Coast, sheer terror, really. I've been in touch with some of the people there along the west coast of Florida who've evacuated out of the Tampa Clearwater area, and they're facing this Category 5 storm, which might weaken by the time it gets to the coast, but very, very serious. And as far as the financial markets are concerned, we mentioned how it's impacting oil already, but also the insurance company stocks, which have had a pretty good run and now facing this catastrophic situation here.
Absolutely. Well, and insurance, as you just brought up, has been a favored play. It's been a favored inflation play because they usually can raise premiums at will within the auspice of an insurance commissioner for a state. There's going to be mixed messages there. I think will be interesting as we go into earnings season because you're going to find out the guidance that any of these property casualty insurers are going to give, and they're going to come out over the next 2 to 3 weeks. But Frank, the bigger issue is going to be, and we have to remember this, that as much as it's not about the tragedy of this, but the effect to the markets, usually storms, unless it hits a financial center, doesn't have a prolonged effect on the financial markets.
Right. As a market historian, I know you've put this in the Investment Atlas 1 and 2, right? It's soon to be Investment Atlas 3. What does history tell us about these kind of disasters?
You know, and it's painful to write it because we all know the human toll. But whether it is Katrina, whether it is Hurricane Andrew, whether it's the tornado storms of the 1970s that ravaged certain parts of our country, as long as it's not a banking financial center, it's usually okay. But let's not forget, Texas now wants to have a stock exchange. So these kind of things could actually start affecting the financial system.
All right. We're also watching what's happening on the tech scene. We saw this report today, but a federal judge today ordering Google to tear down the digital wall shielding its Android app store from competition as a punishment for maintaining an illegal monopoly that helped expand the company's internet empire. According to MarketWatch, that injunction issued by a federal judge will require Google to make several changes that the California-based company had been resisting, including a provision that will require its Play Store for Android apps to distribute rival third-party app stores so consumers can download them to their phones if they so desire. What's your reaction to that report?
Once you get in the crosshair of anybody on antitrust, Microsoft discovered this many years ago. Obviously, you want to go back in history and look at the Standard Oil empire that now became all the big oil companies that are here, or AT&T. Once this starts, at some point, Google is going to have to start breaking some parts of their company up. I was just in the Bay Area last week. I had this talk with a lot of different people from the tech world. The bottom line, Google is taking this very seriously.
All right, NVIDIA, the magnificent one. Let me take a look. Up today, up nearly $3 at $127 and change. What about NVIDIA here?
Well, it's funny, Frank. We just talked about Google. NVIDIA might be in the same boat with the antitrust people about certain technologies. Look, NVIDIA is extremely volatile. I have told investors, if you do not have the stomach for volatility, AI-related stocks might not be for you. It doesn't mean that you can't make money there, but you've got to be able to withstand a lot of volatility. And I just think that for the general investor, be careful. It's kind of like jumping on a running treadmill and hoping you don't stumble. You've got to be very disciplined if you're going to buy this stock.
All right, Super Microcomputer. I don't know if you follow that one. The best day in nearly a year, up $6.50 to $47 and change. Anything we need to know about that one?
Well, there's another example of a company that's kind of tied to AI. There's a whole segment. I have it in my office. I'm calling them AI-related stocks, even though they're broadly in tech. This stock had just been mauled. I will call this a dead cat bounce. I'm not 100% sure that their woes are all past, because you were dealing with accounting problems. You were dealing with a lot of issues that had absolutely nothing to do with AI. So I would have to see the earnings reports and the readjustment of their earnings before I would actually say step in and buy this thing.
All right. Apple has been hitting at or near record highs lately, pulling back today by more than $5. Let's bring up the closing quote here, down to $5.11 to $221.69. What happened with Apple there today?
Here's the thing. There's a concern, and I'm hearing it again when I was in the Bay Area, a lot of talk about Apple. This belief that everybody was going to want an AI phone. There's real concern that the price tag is too high, and that Apple, especially going into the holiday season, there might have to be some acquiescence on the price tag for these phones. And let's face it, the goggles didn't work well. So this is their big push right now.
Very interesting. Anything else catching your attention in the tech space? And it should also be noted, I see a lot of write-ups here that it's the second anniversary of the bull market. Getting a lot of attention here is the is the Mag 7 still going to participate in whatever's coming up next year?
You know what, Frank? I know you mentioned I wrote a new Forbes article talking about the S&P at 6,300 by the end of the year, which, by the way, Goldman Sachs just came out with a report saying 6,000 as well. Here's the thing. I think the leadership is going to shift. It won't be as much tech. In fact, today, I think oil stocks, you could have energy being a major player throughout a good part of this bull market, and a lot of people are underexposed there.
Well, looks like the Gulf of Mexico is going to be especially affected with one of the strongest hurricanes in history with those oil rigs, and hopefully they've all been evacuated at this point. But the damage there is going to be significant, certainly, for all of those offshore rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. That alone is going to take a lot of time to recover.
You know, it's the derricks out there, but I'm actually more concerned about the onshore pipelines, refining capabilities, all that kind of stuff has in many ways a much more profound effect. So, yes, it's going to be something we're going to have to rebuild. But then, Frank, don't forget, we have disruptions in the Red Sea. We have disruptions globally with what's going on with energy on transportation.
All right. And, of course, let me see. There's an election I heard coming up next month, right?
Really? Is there?
Yeah.
I haven't been following that.
No, but let's go there for a second. DJT stock soaring after Elon Musk joined President Trump at the rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, the site of the first assassination attempt on President Trump. But DJT stock, what about that one?
Well, it's pretty funny. If anybody gets Forbes magazine, as I said, I'm biased here because I write for them. They have the richest 400 people in the world, and Donald J. Trump is on the cover of that magazine, and they were talking about how he has now his fortune is now tied to media more so than real estate, which is quite astounding. So it's not a surprise.
All right, and we see Elon Musk, of course, way at the top of that list, right? Around $258 billion, as I recall. I think his net worth went down about $5 billion today.
Hey, the great thing about Mr. Musk, and I've had the privilege of meeting him on several occasions, he always has new ideas of things to invent. So I'm sure he'll come up with some other new companies and other innovations that we'll all marvel about here. But yeah, no, when you look at that whole magazine, the first 10 people, all tied to technology or some form of technology in the last 25 years. And yes, their fortunes are swinging all over the place daily.
Look forward to continuing the conversation here with Ken Winans on Winning with Winans coming up here in the 6 o'clock hour on 790 KBC. We invite you to join us. Ken, it's always great to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us live here this afternoon.
Thank you, Frank.
That is Money Manager Ken Winans, CEO and Chief Investment Officer at Winans Investments, which you can find at winansinvestments.com. Right out to the freeways now on 790 KBC. Frank Mottek here. Folks, did you know that for more than 10,000 years, gold has been the greatest store of value and considered a safe haven asset to preserve your wealth? Well, now with the U.S. debt at more than $35 trillion and climbing, not to mention the Biden administration getting us involved in costly wars, developing the digital dollar, central bank digital currency, and inflation spiraling, it's more critical now than ever before to safeguard your assets, like your cash savings and retirement accounts with physical gold. Opening a gold IRA is one of the best ways to secure your wealth and create a stable financial future for you and your family. Stop worrying about your retirement and the market and cash savings in the bank. Feel confident, prepared, and in control with real physical gold and silver. Give Joe Morgan a call now at 1-800-753-8534. And he'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Again, that number is 1-800-753-8534, or go to UnitedGoldGroup.com. Mottek On Money continues in 790 KBC. Good afternoon. Stocks ending sharply lower today. The Dow down 399 points, coming off its all-time high. We're at 41,954. The S&P 500 down 55 at 5,696. The Nasdaq tumbling 214 points, settling at 17,924, and the yield in the 10-year note now at 4.03%. Insurance company stocks taking a hit today as Florida's storm-battered Gulf Coast, that is, raced against a Category 5 hurricane. Workers sprinting to pick up heaps of appliances and other debris left over from Hurricane Helene, which hit just a couple of weeks ago, and the highways there in Florida clogged with people fleeing ahead of the storm, which is now supposed to be one of the strongest in recorded history. The center of Hurricane Milton could come ashore Wednesday morning in the Tampa Bay region. Looks like it's a Category 5 hurricane now with maximum sustained winds of 175 miles an hour. Could weaken as it comes to the shore, and we'll talk about that coming up here shortly with America's leading hurricane expert, Fox Weather hurricane specialist Brian Norcross will be joining me live coming up in the next half hour. Property and casualty insurance and reinsurance stocks were hit today as Hurricane Milton rapidly strengthened in the last day or so in the Gulf of Mexico, now heading for Florida's Gulf Coast. Taking a look at the cryptos now, we see Bitcoin down $114 at 63,231. Ethereum down up 11 now at 2,452. Doge at the moment at 11 cents. Gold down nearly $3 today at $2,663 and change. Silver down 11 cents at $31.89 after hitting the highs we'd seen in 11 years last week. New reading on inflation coming out on Wednesday. It looks like inflation pressures are building once again, as I just talked about with money manager Ken Winans. This as the price of oil has moved above $80 a barrel once again in the face of the storm, as well as increasing tensions in the Middle East. Nvidia shares up nearly $3 today at $127 and change. Apple pulling back $5.11 to $221.69. At Southern California gas pumps, we're looking at a regular price of $4.58 a gallon on average in the L.A. Long Beach area. Premium now at $4.96 and diesel now at $4.83 a gallon on average. And now the latest news for you here on 790 KABC. Continues here on 790 KABC. New concerns about a flare-up in inflation with the ongoing military action in the Middle East, including the missile attack by Iran against Israel last week, the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, which began a year ago with a terror attack by Hamas on Israel, hurricanes disrupting oil operations in the Gulf of Mexico, including Hurricane Milton, which is one of the strongest hurricanes in recorded history, at winds clocked at an eye-popping 180 miles an hour now. Also in the mix, a port strike back east last week. There have been fears in the financial markets that an extended strike could reignite inflation by disrupting the supply chain and global trade, which in turn could raise doubts about the Fed's ability to continue on the rate cut path that Fed Chairman Jerome Powell and the policymakers of the Fed have laid out. Now, the deal struck last week between the Alliance of Port Operators and the union representing thousands of dock workers last Thursday removes one risk to the economy and eases the threat of a potential near-term resurgence to supply chain disruptions and inflation. But we're not out of the woods yet because of the tentative nature of the deal, which calls for the two sides to fully hash out the details of a new contract by January 15th. The strike has been suspended only until January 15th. And that deadline threatens to exacerbate supply chain bottlenecks as it coincides with critical shipping cycles, including replenishment of inventories post-holiday, spring season product positioning, and preparation for the Chinese New Year, among other things, according to analysts who follow this closely, talking to Reuters. Now, the global supply chain came back into focus recently with last week's port strike, which was temporarily suspended until January 15th. Now, an effort to safeguard the U.S. supply chain with a proposed Supply Chain Act in Congress. And joining us live now, Republican Southern California Congresswoman Michelle Steele, who's filed that proposed Safeguarding the Supply Chain Act. Congresswoman Steele, thank you very much for joining us live this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me today.
Thank you for joining us, and take it from the top and tell us about what you proposed in the face of what's happened recently.
You know what, Safeguarding the Supply Chain Act is that we are adding the longshoremen under the Railroad Labor Act, because 1926 actually originally passed the railroad workers. Then Congress expanded on that same law that airline workers. And now that, you see when they have 1 day strike, it costs, according to JP Morgan analysis, that 1 day strike will cost $5 billion per day, and they already went through 3 day strikes. This is really interesting because everyone is struggling under the Biden and Harris, economy right now, and we have a high inflation and hurt workers the most. And presidential, action is the quickest way to solve it, and it didn't have to happen. But you know what? We cannot trust Biden and Harris to do anything right on the economy, and they are the ones, make double-digit inflations, and then gas prices, you name it. On the top of this, they're adding for 3 day strikes, and not only that, that 1 day strike shutdown alone takes 3 to 5 days to recover from, because all these ships has to move to, from the harbor, and they have to dock and they have to start unloading. So this is not really acceptable because all workers are working really hard and right now, and their economy is not really good under Biden administration. And this is not really we really need. So we want to put under that means that we can put actually both sides back to the negotiation table much faster, and they have to, for the future disputes, say, they can sit on the negotiation table so we can keep our economy moving. And not only that, technically, this still reached only goes until January 15th, means that they have another things coming up. So that's the reason that I introduced this bill.
On the air live with Republican Southern California Congresswoman Michelle Steele, and they're definitely not out of the woods yet with this temporary end of the strike. It's supposed to get a new contract by January 15th. So tell us how this act would affect the situation here. Where do things stand at this point? So basically, both sides would be forced back to the table, right, to try to get this resolved?
Yep, they have to go sit down and they have to talk. They have to negotiate. National Mediation Board oversees the, mediation discussions. And then if parties cannot reach a peaceful solution, then Congress can vote to force an agreement so it doesn't have to go to the strike. And Congress should act based on recommended agreement from an emergency board, established by the president. So this is going to be kind of like a process there is. So it's going to be much easier that they can sit down and negotiate instead of that, going out to the strike. On the top of that environmental issue too, 2021, you remember that we had oil spill because one of the ships. We have all these ships when longshoremen is not really working, they're on the strikes. All these ships, they have to park someplace in the ocean. Under the ocean, we think that, we have only the sands. That's not really true. We have oil pipes, we have sewer pipes. There's so many lines, and we have maps owned under the water. When they put anchor down there, and we ended up having one of the Chinese ship actually hit the oil pipes, we had the oil spill. This is an environmental issue too. So these ships cannot really hanging out there inside of the ocean. They should just come, unload, and reload our stuff and go out. And this is a very serious matter because we saw that in Long Beach and LA port. We have two biggest port in the United States, and we saw that. So environmentally, it's very dangerous. All these ships are there. And then on the top of it, that, it costs $5 billion a day. And then one day shutdown alone takes 3 to 5 days to recover from. So these strikes are totally unnecessary. They should sit down on the negotiation table and they have to talk each other before they go into the strike, and they should not go into the strikes for the people.
On your live with Republican Southern California Congresswoman Michelle Steele. Certainly, inflation pressures have been ignited once again by this situation, as well as this horrible hurricane in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico right now and the ongoing war in the Middle East. What are your we're going to be getting a new reading on inflation this week on Wednesday, which will reflect what's happened in the past month. But recently, it seems there's tremendous pressure on inflation once again.
You know what? Inflation is a hidden taxes, and you know what? It really hurts low-income families a lot. So we really have to lower that. And you know what? During the debate, Trump versus Kamala was actually accusing President Trump that you caused this inflation. Give me a break, because when Trump administration transferred their administration to Biden-Kamala administration, their inflation rate was 1.4% at that time. So this is very important for the hardworking people. This is very important for our economy and national economic interest. We really have to work together. Inflation has to go down. Not only that, in Southern California, we see high gas prices And then all these drugs coming through border security is another important thing. How about the crime in Southern California? California itself has zero bail. You know what? These liberal policies, it's not really helping. But the strikes that for 3 days President Biden has, actually, he could have gone to have, because he has enough power under Taft-Hartley Act to intervene and halt the stoppage. But you know what? He never did. So we cannot really trust this administration. We really have to work hard in Congress, and this bill has to pass, so we're never going to have strike again.
Republican Southern California Congresswoman Michelle Steele, thank you very much for addressing the business community here in Southern California today. We appreciate it and look forward to your updates on the proposed Supply Chain Act now before Congress. Congresswoman Steele, thank you very much for joining us live here this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much. And right out to the freeways now on 790 KABC. Mottek On Money continues on 790 KABC. Good afternoon. Hurricane Milton roaring in the Gulf of Mexico today. The Category 5 hurricane continues to grow stronger, now clocking sustained winds of nearly 180 miles an hour. The center of Milton could come ashore on Wednesday in the Tampa Bay area of Florida, which has not endured a direct hit by a major hurricane in more than 100 years. Joining us live now, America's leading hurricane expert, Fox Weather hurricane specialist, Brian Norcross. Brian Norcross, thank you very much for taking the call at this critical time. Take it from the top here and tell us what we need to know about Hurricane Milton.
Well, Hurricane Milton is one for the record books. It's one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded in modern time. We have a couple of them that we've seen like this. Hurricane Wilma back in 2005 and Hurricane Rita in 2005 were in this territory. But so we have a high-end Category 5 hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico on a path toward the central west coast of Florida. Now, it is expected to weaken, but also expand in size as it approaches the west coast of Florida. So the bottom line is we have an extreme storm surge threat to forecast up to 15 feet above normal high tide in the Tampa Bay area, extending down the coast about 2/3 of the way to Fort Myers, and up to 10 feet in the Fort Myers area that was so decimated by Hurricane Ian. That was just 2 years ago.
And just a couple of weeks ago, Hurricane Helene impacted that area. And I know someone who lives in the Clearwater area, Madeira Beach, and the water came over the top for the first time in history as far as they were concerned. So all of this following the most recent storm.
That's right. You have to go back to 1921 for a hurricane like this, and this could be worse than the 1921 hurricane, where the water went over all of those beaches, St. Petersburg Beach and Longboat Key and all the other islands that border Florida there on the Gulf Coast, and flooded Tampa up to 10, 12, even 15 feet in a hurricane back in the 19th century, where downtown Tampa is today. So it's a very storm surge vulnerable place. Tampa, the Tampa Bay area, the most vulnerable city to hurricane damage of any city on the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic coast. But they just haven't had storms. So you have to go back to 1921 for one that hit there directly. Everything else has been something of a glancing blow, like Helene just 2 weeks ago.
On the air live with America's leading hurricane expert, Fox Weather hurricane specialist Brian Norcross. And certainly this is very unusual to see a storm like this form in the Gulf of Mexico and then come into Florida from the West Coast. We haven't seen anything like this in 100 years. Is that correct?
Well, the storm 100 years ago actually did a more conventional track. It came up from the south and then bent around Tampa Bay and made landfall just to the north. That pushed the water into Tampa Bay. This storm, originating in the western Gulf of Mexico and essentially coming all the way across the Gulf, is extraordinarily unusual, maybe two in history, going back to the mid-19th century. So the track is unusual, many aspects of it, but the bottom line is sometimes we get hurricanes like this, and here we have one at the very, very top end of the scale that has all the makings of a historic hurricane catastrophe in some part of the state of Florida and maybe a good part of the Florida Peninsula.
We're on the air with Brian Norcross, who, by the way, led the Peabody Award-winning coverage of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and it was an honor to be with you on the air back in those days, Brian Norcross.
I remember it well, Frank.
Yes, sir, and the anniversary of that came up just recently at the end of August, and you saved lives, Brian. You were honored for this when you realized, when you looked at those numbers, just as you're looking at the numbers now with Milton, you told people to get into their bathtubs and put mattresses over their heads, and that saved lives. Is it going to be a similar situation this time around here with Milton?
Well, it's a very different situation because the storm isn't going to be as strong, so it's not going to be like a 20-mile-wide tornado, which is what Andrew resembled. In this case, it's going to be storm surge. It's going to be, imagine in Southern California if suddenly the ocean were 15 feet higher. Everywhere that water can go inland, we're talking about unsurvivable storm surge, as we saw killed 140 some people in Hurricane Ian 2 years ago. So this is when the Gulf water rises up and is pushed up over the coastline and in the harbors, inlets, rivers, and bays all along the Florida coast and in the areas near the coast. You just can't survive that, as we saw just a couple of years ago.
Now, with Milton, it's a Category 5. What's the latest clocking of the winds here? Last word was near 180 miles an hour. Is that right?
185 miles per hour.
Wow.
Late information in from the hurricane hunters is that it has continued to intensify in terms of the pressure, continuing to go down. So it's going to have pressure. We don't talk about this a lot outside of the hurricane zone, but in millibars, 900 millibars. Just to give you an idea, Hurricane Andrew was 922. This one is below 900. So it's just rare that we ever see a hurricane in this range. The strongest hurricanes ever measured anywhere have this kind of pressure numbers associated with them. Getting stronger as it approaches the West Florida coastline now, and so it's slowing, and it looks like now. When is it expected to hit the West Florida coast now? Looks like late Wednesday night, maybe overnight. But the good thing about the wind is that it is forecast to weaken. But the thing is that the size of the storm, the diameter of the storm, is forecast to significantly increase. And so you have less wind damage, but you have more storm surge because it's the difference between taking your hand and pushing water in the bathtub or taking your whole arm. Your whole arm just moves more water toward the end of the bathtub. So this is moving more Gulf water toward the coast. It hits the shoreline, it builds up, and then it goes inland. And that's where we're talking about the 10 to 15 feet above normal high tide in a relatively flat place like Florida. You can imagine how far away from the waterline that Gulf water would spread. Brian Norcross, thank you very much for taking the call on this historic storm, Hurricane Milton, heading to the Florida coastline. We'll keep an open line to you, Brian, and hope to get another update from you. That is Fox Weather Hurricane Specialist Brian Norcross. Of course, watch him on Fox, and, of course, follow him on social media as well. This is Mottek On Money on 790 KABC.
Named one of the best personal finance podcasts, The Stacking Benjamin Show with Joe and his friends makes financial literacy fun.
I thought I can just keep spending money, however, do this back of the envelope math if I just cover it by making more money. The three words that make me groan the loudest that broke people say is, I deserve it. I was saying it all the time. Well, I deserve a night out. I don't have any money, but I'll take my last dollars and do a night at a restaurant.
Find out more by searching the Stacking Benjamins podcast, wherever you listen.